So, hi everybody. Like Jay said, my name is Alon, and that's actually oak tree in Hebrew. And I love trees. But what I'm going to present you today is the fact that trees, unfortunately, are not necessarily the ultimate solution to all problems, and that if it's in the wrong place, and done in the wrong way, it might be harmful not only to nature, but also to climate change mitigation. We'll start by trying to focus on what we do have in Israel. And you can see here in this short film, the golden eagle in the grasslands of Israel. Israel is in the semi-arid area. We are not in Northern America or Northern Europe. We are on the edge of the desert, and actually the most beautiful landscapes and species that we have are actually desert or more dry areas which are scarce in trees. These are open grasslands or shrublands, and we have lots of interesting species and beautiful landscape over there. We call it bata. That's a shrubland or grassland in Hebrew. So these are a few of the inhabitants of the grasslands in Israel. And this is, if you will, the negative side of the picture. These are afforestation actions done by the JNF, by Kakal, in the northern Negev. You can see here bulldozers. You can see here earthworks that actually change the entire structure of the terrain. It looks a bit like a preparation of Israel towards the Iranian invasion, but it's actually preparation of the area before planting trees in the northern Negev. This was filmed a bit north of Be'er Sheva. And we actually asked the question, is this the solution? What is the actual problem that these afforestation works are trying to solve? This is also from the same area, that's the area of Be'er Sheva. It might be in the springtime a beautiful blooming area, but this is what it becomes after the heavy machinery of Kakal is going over the area. They pile piles of earth that supposed to stop the runoff water and to hold them, and then they plant the trees. But unfortunately, this is not the natural landscape and the ecological nature of this area. Again, this is the north of this area. This is in the Mediterranean part of Israel, the northern part near the Carmel. Again, you can see here a beautiful grassland, but this is how planting trees is done in Israel today. You do not see a bunch of school kids with their teacher, with a bucket and a small plant. You can actually, they use the heavy machinery in order to plant the trees. And this is what it looks like. This is in the Modi'in area. Again, an area which is an open area, beautiful shrubland, but you can see here piles of newly planted trees. Again, we have nothing against trees, but it's not supposed to be in the wrong place, and it has all kinds of effects, and I will present them briefly. So Israel does have natural, I wouldn't say forests, but natural woodland. Dense, we called it choresh or maki, dense area of trees, but the majority of Israel is actually characterized by ecosystems in which trees are naturally scarce. You can see here the Golan Heights, you can see here the area of the northern Negev. This is in the western Negev. This is in the area of Lachish. And these landscapes actually inhabit all kinds of special biodiversity, special species like this long-legged buzzard. You can see here a type of special lizard, special iris, and they are all unique in the fact that they grow in areas in which trees are naturally scarce. This is not by accident. The ecosystems are actually derived by the geology and by the precipitation. So you can see here, for example, in the Golan Heights that we have lots of basalt volcanic terrain, which is naturally characterized in grasslands. You can see here the Eastern Galil, also area which is characterized in grasslands. You can see here the dunes of the coastal plain, and the red line here is the 200 millimeter line, in which actually this is the desert edge. South of this line, it's a more arid area, which is naturally very rare in tree cover. So up until today, in the past 100 years, 100,000 hectares of land have already been afforested and planted in trees in Israel. And you might think that both sides of the pictures are actually green. So what's the difference? Let's just plant the left-hand side as well. But actually, it does matter if the area is planted or not planted in semi-arid areas, and I will try and present why. And actually, the biggest excuse to try and plant trees in recent years has been climate change. And we all have read probably articles like this article that was talking about a mind-blowing potential to tackle climate change by planting trees globally. And this article in The Guardian is actually based on a very famous article from a year ago that was published in Science, which was called The Global Tree Restoration Potential. And that that research article claimed that this is the ultimate answer to climate change, to just plant lots of trees globally, and then we got the climate change problem solved. Now, let's take a deeper dive into this claim that if we plant lots of trees, we can actually save the planet. This is basically the map in which we're supposed to plant lots of trees and then tackle climate change. And if we take a deeper dive into Eastern Africa, into Tanzania, some of you have probably heard or seen pictures and maybe even visited a very special place in which I point here, which is called the Serengeti Park. And actually the Serengeti is one of the places that you can see this article in Science has suggested to plant trees, to take the beautiful, unique grasslands of Eastern Africa with the elephant and the giraffes and the wildebeest, and to plant trees over there. And this, of course, has raised lots of concerns. This is an article in another research journal, which said the trouble with trees, afforestation plans for Africa was problematic, and they have mapped the afforestation plans with biodiversity, which is sensitive to planting trees, with the native grassland species, and they said that it's going to jeopardize the survival of many iconic species in Africa. So they said, let's keep the savannas and the grasslands of the Serengeti, the Masai Mara, the Kruger Park, the entire African parks, let's keep it as they are and not try to plant trees over there. You can see here that also in the UK, a similar mapping was done. They took the map of the plan to plant trees for afforestation in the UK, and they have found that 30 to 50% of this area, 30 to 50% of ecologically valuable habitats in the UK are going to be lost if they're going to fulfill the full scale of the afforestation plans in the UK. You can see here, according to different habitats, but for example, this specific habitat of grassland is going to be lost by 50%. So this is a very problematic outcome. This is a picture from Ethiopia in which this guy is proudly measuring the newly planted tree to send it to the European donors to show them how beautiful the tree that they have paid for is growing in Ethiopia. The problem is that this is a tree called Acacia saligna. It's an Australian tree. It's considered one of the, it's in the list of the worst 100 invasive species globally. It's a very problematic species which causes fires. It depletes the aquifer from water. A very problematic tree, and we definitely don't want to plant it nowhere outside Australia. But if we now dive into our little holy land, you can see here the same map, and let's take a look at a few of the sites that were presented as potential places for afforestation. And the first place is the Golan Heights, again, an iconic grassland, very unique by its landscape, lots of unique species that will actually be only living in these grasslands. And if it's going to be planted with trees, these species are going to be excluded. Another place is the sand dunes of Nitzanim Park. It's a very special sand dune nature reserve, which kids really like to come and wander in the sand dunes. Again, not the place that you would think it's fits afforestation. And obviously, there was lots of debate and lots of misagreement with this original science research paper. And you can see here that the edition of Science after it was published, there were lots of comment research papers that argued that the original paper was actually wrong. And there are lots of problems in the notion or the concept that if we plant Africa and the Middle East and other places in Europe, we will save the planet. And this is a recent article from the New York Times written by a few of the leading scientists in forest ecology. And they said planting trees will not save the world. And this is true, especially for Israel, but I will present it in a few minutes. So afforestation is not the answer for climate change in Israel and also in many other parts of the world because a few reasons, and I will present all of them, but briefly, this is the highlights. First of all, it's not practical. There's not enough area globally and also in Israel to plant so many areas, so many hectares in order to establish the answer for climate change. The second problem is that there's not enough water and nutrients to feed these trees. Trees do not just grow, out of the air. They need water, they need nutrients, and we just don't have these resources naturally in those areas. There is an overestimation by a fivefold of the potential carbon sequestration that was analyzed by that original article. So even if we plant the entire area and it's going to be filled with forests, it's not going to capture the amount of carbon that they thought it's going to capture. And strangely enough, planting forests in some areas of the world, including the southern part of Israel, is actually warming the climate and not cooling the climate. And I will explain it in a few minutes. But also, this plan is also damaging. It harms biodiversity. And maybe the worst problem is that it creates an illusion of solution that delays the real and painful solutions that basically are let's deal with our economy, fly less, drive less, and reduce carbon emissions. So let's get back to the details. If we take this global massive plan to plant trees in the entire planet, and take our estimated potential that those researchers have analyzed for us, they claim that Israel has 120,000 hectares potentially suitable for planting trees. That's 0.01% of global potential. Try to remember this number. It's not big, but try to remember this number because it's not real. And you probably ask yourself, where in a small country like Israel, there are 120,000 hectares free for afforestation. And I can also already make a small spoiler, there is no such area. And we took the area in which that global plan designated for Israel for potential planting of forests, and we put it on the map, on the Israeli map, and you can see already that the majority of the area that they have designated for planting forests is actually in the desert. This is the Dead Sea, maybe 20, 30 millimeters of annual rain, not hardly enough for sustaining a forest. And so already you can see that it's not practical, but we took and we analyzed it, and we have found that 34% of what they thought can be suitable for planting trees is actually on dry land. 17% is already built urban areas. 16% are agricultural fields, which supposed to produce food for Israel. 8% are already maquis, which is a very dense woodland, which is already naturally tree land over there. 7% are reserves and natural parks, which are supposed to maintain natural biodiversity. 5% is already a planted forest, so you are left with 11% of what was the potential to plant in Israel, which are supposedly free and willing to be planted, out of which 7% are actually in a dry land between 200 and 300 millimeters of annual rain, which is very marginal for planting a forest, and only 4% of the original potential are actually free areas to be planted. Those areas are the grasslands that we are so desperately want to maintain for the Israeli biodiversity. But I can just already show you that out of the original potential plan to plant trees in Israel to fight climate change, out of those 120,000 hectares, which are 0.01% of the global potential, you are actually left with a much smaller number. And these areas, this small number, which is not hardly substantial to fight climate change globally, these are the areas that they want to plant trees in. It's the beautiful Loess plains in the northern Negev. It's the beautiful grasslands of the eastern Galil, and the beautiful areas also in the northern Negev, the blooming areas in the northern Negev. So already you can see that this is not going to be a meaningful answer to climate change, but it's going to be probably harmful. The second problem is that we hardly have any enough water and nutrients to feed all those supposed forests in Israel. But it's not only in Israel. You can see here a research article from 2013 that already said that there are ecological limits to terrestrial biological carbon dioxide removal. And again, I show you the map, and you can see that the majority of the areas that they have marked as potential forests in Israel are in the desert. Unfortunately, because of climate change, the arid line, the line in which south of it, it's too dry to sustain forests, the arid line will move north. So some of the areas which are today supposedly suitable for planting forests are not going to be suitable in 10, 20, 30 years, unfortunately. Also, there's going to be a major precipitation decrease projected for the northern part of Israel, the entire areas which are marked in red. So unfortunately, even areas in the northern part of Israel are going to get less and less rain in the future. So how are we going to sustain all those trees which are going to be planted? Already today, we see increased tree mortality in planted forests versus natural ones. And we see elevated tree mortality due to drought and wildfires already today. And forest long-term survival was doubted south of Kiryat Gat, which is somewhere in this area. So these entire areas are not suitable for planting a forest, unfortunately. That's the reality. The maybe optimistic side of the picture is that the local ecosystems and plant communities in Israel, the local natural biodiversity is actually resilient and suitable for climate change, because the Israeli land has suffered many periods of dry climate. And this research article have found that Middle Eastern plant communities actually tolerate 9 years of drought and have done it well, unlike planted forests. So the good news is that our natural ecosystems, the natural plant species are seems to be more resilient to dry climate and to climate change. Another point is that tree planting is not done on an empty ground. You can see here a planted forest, and you can see here a non-planted forest, a natural grassland in Israel. And actually, grasslands store quite a lot of carbon, but they do it below ground. These plants are all, they store carbon during the spring, and then they assimilate this carbon to the roots, and they store it inside the soil. And this is an article from a research article from California that has suggested that grasslands may be more reliable carbon sinks than forests in California. One of the reasons is, of course, because California suffers from lots of wildfires, but the same phenomenon is unfortunately happens in Israel as well. So store carbon beneath the ground is maybe more reliable as a carbon sink than above the ground in a forest. And of course, if you plant in a grassland and you tilt and you move the soil in order to plant the trees, you of course release carbon in the process. Another problem is that a planted forest is not a natural one. Usually when we imagine a forest, we imagine this picture, this beautiful cloud forest in the Amazonas, but unfortunately most planted forests, they look like this. They are quite homogeneous. They are planted in semi-arid or arid areas, and they do not store the same amount of carbon like a natural cloud forest or rainforest. Actually, that was analyzed, and it was found that plantations cannot imitate the productivity in a natural forest, and their carbon sequestration rate may be slower by 40-fold than the natural forest. And of course, I also remind that if you plant a forest, you usually plant a forest very densely, and then after a decade or two, you come and you take out some of the trees which have not developed. You do all kinds of management actions, which in turn also release carbon to the atmosphere. And I get to the warming effect. I apologize for the spelling mistake earlier, but I get to the warming effect of planting a forest. This is the Yatir forest in northern Negev in Israel. And what you can see here is carbon is not the whole story. And you have a very complex process of balance between carbon that is stored in the trees and the way that the trees are affecting the heat flux in the area. Imagine a very warm day in which you walk outside with a black t-shirt, and you shortly going to feel very warm. Why? Because the black t-shirt is absorbing the sun rays, and it turns them into heat energy. And the exact thing happens if you plant a very dark green patch of forest inside a very light colored area, which is desert. And you can see here that this is the reflection of sun radiation from the soil, from the terrain back to the atmosphere. You can see that the light-colored natural desert reflects the majority of the energy as sun rays back to the atmosphere. It doesn't heat the atmosphere, but the majority of the sun rays in the dark patch of the forest are actually transformed into heat, and it actually produces a warming effect. And it was actually analyzed, calculated for the Atir forest, and it was found that it takes at least 30 years from the minute they have planted the forest until the warming effect is balancing with the carbon effect, and it starts to have some kind of a cooling effect over the atmosphere. So I don't think that we have today the time to wait 80 years until some kind of forest in Israel is going to have the cooling effect that we want. We don't have that much time. We are in an emergency in terms of climate change. And almost last but not least is the problem with the delusion of a solution. Policymakers try to avoid politically costly measures. This, what you see here is the demonstration after President Macron in France have tried to put a tax on the fuel in order to put incentives for the public to reduce carbon emissions. And of course, people have went to the streets and said, no, we don't want to pay more about fuel. And then you come to the same policy makers and you say, look, you don't have to make any major politically costly measure. You can just plant trees. Everybody loves trees. But then you have a delusion of a solution. It's not going to solve climate change. The window for real change in terms of policy is closing fast, and we do not tackle the major reasons why climate change happens, which are emissions and the need to reduce emissions to move to renewable energies, etc. So this is a very drastic problem with the delusion of forests as the ultimate solution for climate change. And the reason why I'm in this, making this whole talk is because of the damage to biodiversity. I'll try to be brief because I see that I have already talked too much. Israel is not a big country. It's not a major carbon producer in terms of climate change, but it is in a very, very special place and unique place in terms of biodiversity. This is the biodiversity global hotspot map, which have designated less than 2% of terrestrial global area as the most important places for biodiversity conservation. You can see here Amazonas, you can see here Central America, California, New Zealand, the Caucasus, Madagascar, and Eastern Africa, and you can also see the Mediterranean area, including Israel. So we are a very special place in terms of biodiversity, and we have to keep it that way. So I've already shown you this picture. Many ecosystems in Israel are naturally not planted with trees, and because of that, there are lots of unique species over there. Now, one might say, okay, if we plant trees, we don't have, let's say, a few species, we'll have other species. What does it matter? So in this research, they have measured the effect on the number of species after they have planted forests. And you can see that while turning shrublands or grassland into planted forests, there is actually a decrease in the number of species. But this is not actually the right question. The right question is which species were excluded and which species have benefited. And what we have found after compiling lots of research articles that were done in Israel and in other similar places is that afforestation in sensitive natural areas replaces the natural animal and plant community and excludes native and especially species like those animals that you see here, like those beautiful birds that are all from Israel. And I will just briefly show you a few slides just to show you that I'm not making this up. You can see the reference for the right scientific source in each of the different ecosystems and different taxonomic groups. So for birds, this was found, what I've just showed you was found to be true in the Loess plains in Israel, in the northern Negev, in the semi-steppe shrublands in Israel, and in Mediterranean shrubland. Briefly, the reason is because once you plant trees, you enable predators like ravens and like small raptors to stand on these trees. And if a songbird is trying to nest in a small shrub beneath this tree, it's going to be spotted by this predator that sits on the tree, and it's going to be eaten. And again, predators like this beautiful long-legged buzzard, some of you might see that there's a lizard in his claws. These raptors are not adapted for hunting in forests. They are adapted to hunt in an open area. And not only that they need those open areas in order to hunt for their food, they need it in order to hunt and feed their chicks. And this long-legged buzzard was found to bring 260 prey individuals from those open, unforested areas into the nest in each season, in each nesting season. So those top predators, they actually need large areas, vast areas, which are not planted with trees in order to hunt the prey to feed the chicks. It was also found for this beautiful short-toed eagle, which mainly feeds on snakes. Snakes need, in Israel, the majority of the snakes need the open patches which is not forested in order to get the sun radiation to hit their bodies. This way was also found for reptiles in the Loess plains. You can see here the diversity of reptiles in a natural area, and you can see here how the diversity shrinks in a planted forest. And you can also see that this species, the Beersheba fringe-fingered lizard, an endemic critically endangered species of a lizard in Israel, is totally absent from the forested area, and it is present in the natural area. So this species is actually on the verge of extinction, among other things, because of afforestation in Israel. It's endemic and critically endangered. This was also found for other types of ecosystems for reptiles in the semi-steppe shrublands, in the Mediterranean shrubland, etc. And it was also found for butterflies in the prairies of Israel, in the Mediterranean shrublands. These three beautiful species of butterflies are actually excluded, totally excluded from the area after the planting of trees. Again, it was found for spiders in the Loess plains, for scorpions in the desert. It was found for wild bees in the Mediterranean shrublands. So you get the picture. And all the details are in the report that we have compiled. Why does it happen? It happens because a few ecological processes. The first is because of what I told you, the decrease in shrubland foraging areas for big raptors. It happens also because of shading or leaf litter or loss of heterogeneity in the habitat, because of fragmentation, direct damage to the soil, like I told you, by the heavy machinery, and direct impact on natural resources. But it gets even more complicated because planted forests are usually, they have an edge effect on the adjacent natural areas because of fragmentation, or even because of the pines that migrate slowly into the natural area. And this research have shown that from this forested pine area, the pines are slowly migrating into the shrubland, and after they spread, forest species like the jay actually migrate and use the pines in order to widen their area of foraging, and they have found to damage and to hunt small chicks of songbirds, which were nesting in small shrubs. So dozens of thousands of hectares in Israel of natural areas can actually be saved. They do not have to look like this homogeneous planted forest in the northern Negev. They can look like these areas, or these areas, or these areas which are beautiful, which are unique, which store carbon, which are great for recreation, and which hold unique biodiversity. And basically what we say is keep and maintain the existing forests in Israel. Do not touch them, use them for recreation, but also do not harm and do not disrupt the natural areas. Keep them for recreation and biodiversity, but as they are. Do not plant them because it doesn't help climate and it damages the biodiversity. And we think that there's a time for a change in the narrative that we have to plant trees everywhere that we can. And basically what we say globally is, first, protect existing forests everywhere. If it exists, protect it, do not touch it. Second, and this is not our call, this is something that the leading scientists for forest ecology globally has said, restore natural forests in the tropics and subtropics, because on those areas, the forests do not have the warming effect, they have the cooling effect for capturing carbon, but do it naturally. Help the natural forests to rehabilitate, do not just plant artificial man-made plantations. Prevent wildfires, reduce emissions, fly less, drive less, buy less, and of course, manage the entire energy sector accordingly. For Israel, the same recommendation, and of course, protect the natural ecosystems, the grasslands, and the natural drylands in Israel. Do not plant trees because it just doesn't help. And I will just end by showing you that there's lots to be done in managing the natural areas. There are lots of projects, beautiful projects that we do in order to preserve the natural open areas which are not forested, which are actually natural ecosystems in Israel. And I will just show you one example. The example is of this beautiful bird. It's the Khubara bustard, very unique, very rare bird that lives in Israel. We have something like 300 pairs in Israel. And this interesting bird is nesting in the Nitzana area. It's right in the edge, in the border with Egypt. But every summer it walks. It can fly, but it prefers to walk. So it walks something like 60 kilometers to one place called Hazerim in the summertime. And I guess you imagine that this is a nature reserve, but unfortunately it's not. Although it looks like a nature reserve, it is actually the biggest Air Force base in Israel, called the Hazerim Air Force Base. And this is an area, it's actually fenced because of the security issues, but because it is fenced, it doesn't have herds of sheep that eat the grassland, and it has lots of food for the birds. And what we have done for the past few years is actually work with the army base, with the pilot course cadets, and we have showed them the birds, the Khubara bastards, and we have persuaded them not to plant forests inside the base, but actually to keep the natural grassland and to clean all the garbage that the base has put there in 50 years. You can see here the cadets after one of the activities with all the garbage that they have collected and was actually afterwards transferred to a garbage site. So to conclude, we need to stop afforestation in sensitive natural ecosystem in Israel. We can and we should plant trees within cities, within settlements, but not in the natural areas. It is just not helping climate change and it is harmful. And there's lots to be done in order to preserve the natural areas. It helps the climate change fight and it helps biodiversity. And of course, it maintains the landscape of our country and the same landscape that our ancestors have actually witnessed in generations before us.
Wow.
And that's it.